Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a story of, it's really high-stakes commercial geometry.
It really is.
The U.S. draws this protective wall around itself with these massive anti-China tariffs. And then it just has to watch as that very wall becomes the central infrastructure for its main economic rival.
It's a spectacular irony. Washington built the roadblock, and Beijing they just built a highway around it.
A highway that runs straight through America's closest economic partners.
Exactly. We're talking about a story of brilliant trade arbitrage, where China used the existing North American Trade Agreement, the USMCA, as its primary tool. They essentially turned Mexico and Canada, America's official trade allies, into these incredibly effective commercial conduits.
And in doing so, they completely nullified the stated goals of U.S. protectionist policy.
Completely.
So our mission today is to really understand the mechanics of this complex evasion, and I think its lasting economic consequences. We're looking at sources that reveal exactly how China cleverly routed its massive trade flows through those USMCA partners.
Mexico and Canada.
Right, Mexico and Canada, to completely bypass American tariffs. And we'll track the brutal political pressure Washington applied in 2025 to try and stop it, and maybe most crucially, why analysis suggests these new defensive tariffs, they probably won't work in the long run.
This deep dive is so crucial because it shows the immense gap between political intent and economic reality. Policies designed to reshore jobs often run straight into this brick wall of global supply chain efficiency.
So if you want to understand why the world's manufacturing map is so much more complex and, I guess, resilient than policymakers want to admit, this is really the story you need to hear.
It really is.
So let's set the stage first. Let's go back to 2018. What was the original intent of those tariffs? It wasn't just about revenue, was it? It was supposed to be a fundamental reset.
Oh, it was nothing short of revolutionary in modern American trade policy. The intention, starting under the Trump administration and, essentially continuing in scope and philosophy today, was explicitly designed to hurt China enough to force a fundamental change.
A change in their economic behavior?
Well,
their manufacturing supremacy?
Exactly. And the scope just grew so rapidly. You're right. It started with metals, but it quickly became almost universal.
So we're not just talking steel and aluminum here.
No, not at all. The policy context began with major tariffs on those foundational commodities, often at a punishing 25% rate. But that rapidly expanded through what they call the Section 301 lists to include, virtually everything the American consumer buys or an American factory uses.
Like what?
Technology components, vast swaths of textiles, industrial parts, machinery, consumer goods. We saw tariff rates in critical sectors just consistently hitting 25% on the import value.
And the narrative coming out of Washington it was very clear, wasn't it? They kept promising this new era of American industrial greatness. What were the main goals the public was sold on?
The goals were explicit and, very politically resonant. First, to drastically reduce the massive trade deficit with China, which was framed as a sign of economic exploitation.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, and maybe most importantly, to force manufacturing activity, the jobs, the factories, back home, what they called reshoring.
And third,
to protect American workers and industries from what was labeled, unfair, subsidized Chinese competition.
But when we fast forward almost 6 years, what does the global trade reality actually look like? That promise of reshoring, it really hasn't materialized on the scale they hoped for.
Not even close. And that's the critical takeaway here. The strategy failed to achieve its primary objectives. Contrary to what many in Washington were secretly hoping for, China did not suffer an economic collapse.
But their direct exports to the U.S. did fall, right? And Washington celebrated that.
They did, and that's the number the U.S. often celebrates. But the overall global system proved far too interconnected, far too resilient to be shut down by a single tariff wall.
So if the trade deficit didn't just vanish and the factories didn't all come rushing back to Ohio, what happened instead?
China's response was, the sources call it brilliant pragmatism. They just analyzed the new reality and determined the most cost-effective solution wasn't to fight the tariffs head-on.
By lowering prices or lobbying?
Right. It was to completely skip them. They deployed a geographical flanking maneuver. Instead of going directly across the Pacific into U.S. ports, they decided to transit through the U.S.'s own protected trade zone, North America.
I want to pause on that for a moment. Why did the U.S. strategy fail so fundamentally to bring manufacturing back home? I mean, tariffs are supposed to make foreign goods more expensive, which should make domestic goods more competitive.
Well, the core reason is structural. Manufacturing decisions aren't based on one variable. They're based on this complex equation of labor costs, regulatory environment, energy supply, political stability, and critically, the existence of an established, efficient supply chain ecosystem.
And the Chinese ecosystem is it's massive.
It's decades in the making and incredibly difficult to replicate quickly. Tariffs added a cost, yes, but that cost was easily offset by simply moving the final assembly step to a location that offered tariff immunity, like Mexico.
So they made the tariff evasion route cheaper and easier than paying the penalty or, and undertaking the massive capital investment of actually reshoring to the U.S.
Exactly. It was a simple business calculation.
So the key to this whole scheme is America's own regional trade agreement. What specific mechanism within the USMCA, the replacement for NAFTA, made Mexico and Canada the perfect targets for this strategy?
The entire system hinges on the concept of tariff-free access for goods produced within the North American zone. That's the whole point of USMCA.
Right.
But the gatekeeper for this tariff-free access is this complex set of regulations known as the Rules of Origin, or ROO. And this is where the legal creativity comes in.
For anyone listening, the rules of origin are basically the standards that determine a product's nationality for trade purposes. So if the U.S. wanted to protect itself, shouldn't those rules have been really strict?
Theoretically, yes. But in practice, especially across many categories, the ROO under USMCA only require that a certain percentage of the product's total value is produced or added within the USMCA territory.
And the sources are clear on this, for a lot of sectors. That minimum value add was set surprisingly low.
Very low.
How low are we talking? What was the specific vulnerability?
The source material suggests that this minimum required threshold was sometimes as low as 10 to 15% of the final product's value.
Wait, only 10 to 15%? That seems incredibly low.
It is. Think about that for a moment. You can have a sophisticated piece of electronics where 85 to 90 cents of every dollar of content originated in China, the chips, the chassis, the screen, and simply by adding 10 to 15 cents of local labor or packaging or minimal assembly in Mexico, that product legally transformed.
It becomes a Mexican product.
For the purposes of entering the U.S. market, yes, it gets a new passport.
That is the central gaping vulnerability. It allowed Chinese firms to keep effective control over the entire supply chain and just delegate the last, least complex step to North America.
Yeah.
But how do they even calculate that value? Is it straightforward?
Well, that's a brilliant question because the complexity of the calculation is precisely what allows for the arbitrage. When you're determining if a good meets the ROO, USMCA typically allows for a few different methods.
Okay.
The most common ways to show value add are the transaction value method and the net cost method.
Can you just quickly break those down?
Yeah.
How do they help this scheme?
Sure. Under the transaction value method, the calculation is based on the actual price of the final product minus the price of all the non-originating the Chinese components. The trick here is that if the final assembly in Mexico is deemed the most valuable part, that 15% local requirement can be met pretty easily.
Even if the physical bulk is Chinese.
Right. But more importantly, under the net cost method, which looks at total cost minus profit, Chinese companies can use creative accounting and something called transfer pricing to minimize the declared cost of those initial Chinese components.
Making the local labor cost look like a much higher percentage of the total.
You've got it. This complexity means the rule is easy to meet if you have a team of specialized trade lawyers.
So once Chinese companies identified this legal vulnerability, this low 10 to 15% bar, how quickly did they act? What did it look like on the ground?
They acted with impressive speed. They moved capital almost instantly, which is typical of these major Chinese industrial firms. Their strategy wasn't to buy American. It was to become North American in name only.
So they set up shop.
Massively, they rapidly established huge operations across both Mexico and Canada. This meant building new assembly plants, creating local subsidiaries with names designed to sound regional, and forming joint ventures with existing Mexican or Canadian firms to get instant local expertise and, political legitimacy.
The logistics of that. It must have been a sight to behold. It was a complete reversal of global shipping routes.
A huge logistical pivot. Instead of sending finished goods, they shipped intermediate products and complex components, the bulk of the value across the Pacific.
Things like circuit boards or car parts.
Exactly. Partially finished electronic circuit boards, pre-cut auto body panels, Unassembled machinery kits, bolts of synthetic textiles, these arrived in enormous volumes as intermediate goods destined for these new North American facilities.
And when those complex Chinese components arrive in, say, Monterey or Vancouver, the local facility performs that crucial minimal value add step. What does that minimal processing actually look like?
It can be anything from basic final assembly, bolting together 5 Chinese parts with 1 Mexican-made plastic casing, to simple repackaging for the U.S. market, or just getting a quality certification.
That small effort, that 10% local input, was the legal magic wand.
It was just enough to legally and technically qualify the entire product as Mexican product or Canadian product under those generous USMCA rules.
And with that new passport, those essentially Chinese products cross the U.S. border completely free of the 25% anti-China tariffs.
The system worked, as the sources note, spectacularly brilliantly well for years. It's a textbook case of how political intent gets undermined by legal structure and economic efficiency.
What's fascinating here is how the trade statistics just immediately prove the scale of this whole maneuver. The numbers show this massive synchronized shift that tells a story Washington really tried to ignore.
Oh, absolutely. Let's start with the direct U.S.-China trade. That drop was real, and Washington took a victory lap for it.
Right, they did.
Direct U.S. imports from China fell notably after this first tariffs in 2018-2019. Trade dropped from its peak of over $650 billion annually down to about $550 billion.
That's a $100 billion drop.
And that drop was publicly touted as hard evidence the tariffs were working, that the U.S. was reducing its dependence on China.
But the trade volume didn't just disappear into thin air. It changed its address. What was happening at the same time on the North American borders?
A simultaneous explosion. That's the only word for it. U.S. imports from Mexico and Canada exploded vertically like a rocket, completely negating that direct drop from China.
And Mexico was the big winner here.
Mexico benefited massively, became the largest U.S. trading partner in 2023, surpassing China for the first time in decades. The U.S.-Mexico bilateral trade exceeded a staggering $700 billion annually.
$700 billion. I mean, that level of trade makes Mexico absolutely essential to the U.S. economy. But the big question remains, what percentage of that $700 billion is really a shift in traditional North American production, and how much is just Chinese cargo with a new stamp on it?
And that measurement difficulty is intentional. The whole point is to obfuscate the origin. But analysts, by tracking component flows and FDI trends, have made some pretty robust estimations.
What do they suggest?
They suggest that somewhere between 30 to 40% of the total value of Mexican exports to the U.S. now has significant Chinese origin.
30 to 40%.
Yes. This is Chinese value that would have been taxed at 25% had it come directly from Shanghai.
So we're potentially talking about $200 billion to $280 billion in trade. That is technically Mexican on paper, but substantially Chinese in its cost and content.
Precisely. And that figure alone accounts for the vast majority of the lost direct imports from China.
And Canada.
The Canadian channel is a bit smaller in total volume, but the percentage of Chinese components in their exports to the U.S. is still substantial, estimated at maybe 15 to 20%.
So the outcome is crystal clear. China maintained nearly total access to the American consumer. The tariffs just created two very wealthy intermediaries, Mexico and Canada.
The consumer in the U.S. bought essentially the same products, maybe for a tiny bit more.
Let's focus on that Mexican economic boom for a minute. What did that massive influx of Chinese foreign direct investment, or FDI, look like on the ground? It must have been transformational for some of those border cities.
Transformational and immediate. Before 2018, Chinese FDI into Mexico was, modest. After the tariffs hit, the investment literally exploded. It just multiplied exponentially. And they weren't just renting existing space, they were building massive brand new facilities.
And which regions and industries saw the most activity?
The investment was really concentrated in those key border manufacturing zones, the maquiladoras, so Tijuana, especially the Mesa de Otay area, Mexicali, and the industrial hubs near El Paso, like Ciudad Juarez, and also further south in Monterey.
And what were they making?
Chinese firms dominated new investment in electronics assembly, the entire supply chain for auto parts and accessories, especially EV components, and basic machinery production.
So the result for Mexico was new plants running 24/7, massive job creation, thousands of jobs for Mexican workers, and huge surges in local and state tax revenue. It was a clear, unalloyed economic victory for both Beijing and Mexico City.
It was a classic economic win-win. China secured market access and a competitive edge. Mexico received desperately needed capital, some technology transfer, and job growth. The whole process was called nearshoring, but the reality was that it was often China shoring.
And the loser in this dynamic was the U.S. policy itself.
Undoubtedly. The U.S. consumer paid marginally higher prices, and the protectionist policy completely failed to bring manufacturing home.
Now, if we shift north, the Canadian case provides this perfect, specific example of the evasion, the so-called metal washing scheme. How did Canada facilitate the movement of all that Chinese steel and aluminum into the U.S.?
Right. The steel and aluminum tariffs were some of the first and most severe because China has this massive excess capacity in these foundational metals. The mechanism was just simple geographic exploitation. Mass quantities of high-volume, low-cost Chinese steel were shipped across the Pacific to Canadian ports, often priced below market value.
And what happened there that allowed it to become Canadian in the eyes of U.S. Customs?
It was minimal processing that triggered that ROO status change. In these Canadian facilities, the steel might undergo simple actions like being cut into specific dimensions or having a protective coating applied or just getting high-grade certification and packaging.
So not a lot of value being added.
Very little. It might even involve blending the Chinese steel with a tiny percentage of Canadian origin raw material. These minimal value add steps were enough. The steel then crossed into the U.S. as tariff-free Canadian steel, bypassing the huge anti-dumping and anti-China tariffs?
And Canada benefited by acting as the profitable washing platform.
Exactly. They collected fees for processing and logistics. It illustrates perfectly how trade, when incentivized by tariffs, will always find the lowest regulatory and financial pathway. It's an immediate, predictable reaction.
So this brilliant evasion scheme worked for years. But then everything changed in early 2025. The stability of this whole system was suddenly threatened, not by economics, but by politics. What was the catalyst? What forced Mexico and Canada to finally shut down their lucrative roles?
The catalyst was the return of a highly protectionist administration in Washington after the 2024 election. When the new team took over in January 2025, their number one priority was closing that trade deficit. And they quickly put the pieces together.
The puzzle was pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
Direct Chinese trade down, Mexican-Canadian trade way up.
Exactly. They saw the massive, obvious leakage. They realized China was simply skirting their carefully designed tariffs by using America's neighbors as distribution centers. The response from Washington was immediate, direct, and aggressive.
And it completely redefined the geopolitical balance of North America overnight.
It did.
What did this pressure campaign actually look like? Was it quiet diplomatic negotiation, or was it something more heavy-handed?
Oh, the sources describe it as massive, brutal, relentless pressure. There was no soft diplomacy involved here. Washington used explicit threats to completely renegotiate USMCA, which would throw the entire North American economy into chaos.
And there were direct threats of tariffs against them, too.
Yes, critically, there were explicit threats to impose debilitating tariffs, Section 232 or 301 tariffs on Mexico and Canada themselves if they did not immediately close the Chinese transit road. The message was unambiguous: cooperate or we will cripple your economy.
Let's focus on Mexico's position here. The new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, only took office in October 2024. She comes from a party, Morena, that really values national sovereignty. Why couldn't Mexico just tell Washington that their economic interests lay with continued Chinese investment?
And that is the core geopolitical tragedy of Mexico's position. While President Sheinbaum might ideally prefer independence and a robust relationship with Beijing, which, just provided all this massive investment, the economic reality is, as the sources say, brutal and inescapable.
And that reality is the trade asymmetry.
It's the crippling asymmetry of dependence. The United States represents approximately 80% of all Mexican exports.
80%.
80. That is an almost colonial level of economic dependency. Mexico's entire economy is tethered to unfettered access to the U.S. market. If the U.S. border slows down, or if the U.S. slaps even a 10% tariff on Mexican exports, the lights go out in Mexico City.
So if the U.S. had followed through on its threat, what was the immediate foreseeable consequence for Mexico?
An immediate, severe, and catastrophic recession. We're talking about massive, rapid job losses across their crucial manufacturing sector, and an immediate political crisis that would have destabilized the brand new administration.
So she had no choice.
She simply did not have a real option. She had to yield to U.S. pressure to prevent an economic catastrophe, even if it meant antagonizing China.
Which forced Mexico into this incredibly awkward position of doing Washington's dirty work.
Mm.
What exact actions did they take in mid-2025?
The Mexican Chamber of Deputies approved tariffs of up to 50% on imports from China and other key Asian countries.
50%. That is a huge number.
It's stunning. 50% is not a trade adjustment, it's a punitive barrier. It's designed to make the continued use of Mexico as a transit route economically unviable. They had to make the costs so high that the entire arbitrage scheme would collapse instantly.
And what was the official reason they gave for, basically antagonizing their huge new source of FDI and jobs?
Well, officially, the Mexican government claimed it was necessary to boost national production and correct trade imbalances, the kind of rhetoric you need for public consumption. But everyone in Beijing, Mexico City, and Washington knew the real, singular reason.
Direct pressure.
Direct, relentless pressure from the U.S. Mexico was implementing an aggressive protectionist policy at the explicit, non-negotiable demand of its northern neighbor.
And Canada faced similar pressure, especially over that blatant metal washing scheme. What was their specific response in July of 2025?
Canada also capitulated. They announced an extra 25% tariff specifically on Chinese origin steel. This was a surgical policy designed to target that very narrow loophole that allowed Chinese metal to be re-exported.
So on the surface, it looks like Washington won. The loophole appears to be closed. But now we have to ask the critical question. Will this actually work to stop China's access to the U.S. market in the long run?
And if we connect this reaction to the broader picture of global supply chains, the comprehensive analysis suggests that these new North American tariffs will be much, much less effective than Washington hopes.
They may have stopped the Mexican route.
But China is already several steps ahead thanks to massive prior investment in redundancy.
Okay, so let's start with the fundamental flaw. You're relying on two countries to close a global loophole. The sources suggest China already has extensive alternative routes ready to go.
That is the first and most obvious reason for predicting failure. China's planning is long-term and strategic. They never rely solely on one or two transit countries. Mexico and Canada were just the most convenient because of the generous USMCA rules.
But they have others?
They have dozens of other countries they already use as re-export platforms. These are networks that were established long ago.
So which regions are now positioned to immediately absorb the $200 billion or more that just got blocked in Mexico?
The Southeast Asia channels are the immediate and massive beneficiaries. We are talking about Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Cambodia. The exact same arbitrage scheme works there, just under different bilateral agreements.
Same process. Chinese components go in, get minimal processing.
Right, sometimes just repackaging, labeling, final certification, and then they're immediately re-exported as, say, Vietnamese product or Malaysian product.
The numbers coming out of a place like Vietnam are really startling, and they demonstrate that this shift is already well underway.
They do. Exports from Vietnam to the U.S. grew an astonishing 400% in the last decade, turning Vietnam into a manufacturing powerhouse. And analysts already estimate that 40 to 50% of those surging exports have significant Chinese origin.
So if the Mexican route gets harder or more expensive because of the new tariff, China just intensifies the use of these existing Asian routes.
Precisely. Washington closes one door in North America, and 10 doors widen simultaneously across the Pacific.
Which means the U.S. trade deficit with China might just transform into an equally large trade deficit with Vietnam or Thailand.
It just moves the number from one column to another.
But even within Mexico itself, the Chinese strategy is evolving beyond that simple assembly model. It's becoming something far more robust and legally defensible. This is the shift toward what the sources call legalized evasion.
And this is the second and I think most permanent reason why the U.S. strategy is doomed to have a limited effect. Chinese operations in Mexico are moving beyond simple tariff evasion via assembly. They're moving toward developing real, substantial, and legally compliant manufacturing capacity.
So they realized that relying on that low 10% rule was risky, and now they're aiming for 30 or 40% local content.
Exactly.
Can you give us some specific examples of this transition from assembly to genuine industrial capacity?
Absolutely. Take BYD, the massive Chinese electric vehicle manufacturer. They are not building a simple factory to bolt together imported kits. They are building a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing complex in Mexico for real car manufacturing. That includes stamping, painting, and producing local components where they can.
And what about other industries?
Companies like Hitsense, they built large appliance plants in Mexico that are now actively integrating local supply chains to produce their own components.
So if these new sophisticated operations are genuinely adding value and meeting the technical rules of origin, even under stricter scrutiny, then the final product is no longer Chinese cargo. It is, by treaty, Mexican.
Precisely. The product is legally, technically, and demonstrably manufactured in Mexico. The ownership, the technology, the ultimate profit repatriation, that all remains Chinese. But the product itself complies with the letter of the USMCA treaty.
So how can the U.S. apply an anti-China tariff to an EV that is, by legal definition, a Mexican product?
It pushes the entire trade dispute into an incredibly difficult legal and practical gray zone. It makes the tariffs completely obsolete for these more sophisticated manufacturers.
And this really speaks to the sheer resource allocation by Beijing. The source material mentioned they have entire armies of commercial lawyers dedicated to navigating and exploiting these rules.
And that's the third critical line of defense: complexity and legal creativity. China isn't fighting a trade war with tariffs. They're fighting it with logistics, accounting, and legal engineering. They have decades of experience circumnavigating every form of trade barrier imaginable.
They know there are, as the source said, 1,000 ways to evade.
Exactly. And those ways go far beyond simple transshipment.
So what are some of the more sophisticated structural strategies we should expect to see now as a direct result of these new Mexican tariffs?
Well, we should expect an immediate rise in structures designed specifically to obscure origin and ownership. This includes more complex joint ventures to minimize the visibility of the Chinese parent company. We'll see multi-layered shell companies operating across various low-regulation jurisdictions.
Triangulating the trade?
Yes, perhaps parts traveling from China to Vietnam, then to a Caribbean free trade zone, and only then to Mexico, which further clouds the paper trail.
And the accounting tricks will become even more aggressive, specifically around transfer pricing. We should probably define that concept clearly.
Yes, transfer pricing is critical. This is essentially the practice of setting prices for goods or services sold between related entities of the same multinational company in different countries.
So a Chinese parent company sells a circuit board to its own Mexican subsidiary.
Right. Let's say that board is worth $100. Using transfer pricing, they might artificially declare its value to be only $5 on the customs forms.
By doing that, they minimize the reported value of the Chinese component for the rules of origin calculation.
And that ensures the Mexican added value easily meets the local content threshold, even the stricter ones.
So the U.S. policy just generates massive economic distortion, huge legal fees, and incredible complexity. But it fails to stop the goods from flowing.
That's the consequence of trying to fight economic fundamentals with political blunt instruments. China has the capital, the motivation, and the expertise to ensure continued access. Their access is certain. The only variable is the complexity and the marginal cost of maintaining it.
Finally, let's talk about the practical enforcement in Mexico. Mexico was forced to implement this 50% punitive tariff, but will they actually enforce it rigorously on the ground?
And this is the political theater aspect, which is the fourth major vulnerability. Mexico is caught in an impossible balancing act. They can't fully antagonize the U.S., which owns 80% of their economy, but they also can't afford to alienate China, which is their second largest commercial partner and a vital source of investment.
So the prediction is a form of calculated non-enforcement.
I think so. It's the classic Mexican approach of what the sources call diplomacy of appearance over real substance. They implemented the 50% tariffs publicly to satisfy Washington. But in the practical day-to-day operations of customs and trade verification, enforcement will likely be much softer.
So minimal verification of origin, limited resources.
And exceptions will be generous and widely applied to keep that Chinese capital pipeline at least partially open.
And that leads to the fifth critical point, which is the collateral damage this does to Mexico's own genuine manufacturing base. Are those 50% tariffs hurting legitimate Mexican companies, making exceptions inevitable?
Absolutely. The tariffs create massive counterproductive economic distortions. Many Chinese imports are not consumer goods for rerouting. They are completely legitimate, sometimes irreplaceable industrial imports.
Needed by genuine Mexican companies that produce goods for the U.S. market.
Right. Think highly specialized electronic components, proprietary software, or sophisticated industrial machinery that only China produces cost-effectively.
So if Mexico slaps a 50% tariff on that specialized machinery, their own factories suddenly become uncompetitive against rivals in, say, India or Vietnam.
Precisely. Applying that punitive tariff dramatically increases the production costs for real Mexican manufacturing, harming Mexico's own ability to compete globally. So those genuine Mexican companies will pressure the Sheinbaum administration heavily for broad exceptions, for carve-outs and exemptions.
And once that list of exceptions is published, the loopholes begin to emerge instantly.
The floodgates open. Every exception is a breach, a pathway that Chinese companies and their legal teams will creatively exploit. The result is that the entire tariff structure quickly becomes riddled with holes, making it far less effective than that high 50% number suggests.
The policy's own severity creates the political and economic pressure necessary to undermine its own enforcement.
The core insight here really is that tariffs are political tools, but global trade is an economic force. U.S. consumers demand affordable products, U.S. corporations demand maximum margins, and China is relentless in demanding access to the $25 trillion U.S. market. These economic realities are just far more powerful than any protectionist political policy.
So what does this all mean for the future of North American trade? The tariffs created complexity, they generated high-stakes political theater, and they temporarily benefited Mexico as a transit point. But they failed to change the fundamental reality of where global manufacturing supremacy resides.
China established these adaptable global networks years ago, making single-country protectionism virtually impossible to enforce.
And the U.S. is caught in this fundamental contradiction. Washington wants to appear tough on Beijing and maintain stable, low inflation for the American consumer, but trying to completely remove efficient Chinese manufacturing from the equation, that would cause massive, immediate price hikes across the American economy.
They would.
Therefore, the trade will continue. It'll flow through Vietnam, Thailand, and increasingly through these complex, compliant manufacturing facilities in Mexico. It will just flow with more steps, more paperwork, and marginally higher costs. The evidence strongly suggests that China effectively won this round of the trade war years ago.
They won it by deploying their manufacturing footprint into America's own neighborhood, forcing the U.S. to attack its own allies to try and stop the flow.
We've seen how Mexico and Canada became these essential conduits under American pressure, forcing them to turn against their new economic partner, China. Now, if you consider the intense reliance of the U.S. on its neighbors for trade stability, and you remember those massive Chinese investments in Mexico, visible now in industrial zones, in huge factories, in technology transfer, how might China leverage this deep, localized economic integration to exert its own geopolitical pressure in the future, especially if U.S.-China tensions escalate? That integration isn't just economic, it's a form of embedded soft power, something for you to mull over. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. If you found this discussion of commercial arbitrage and geopolitical chess interesting, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Share your opinion in the comments. Do you think the U.S. can find a way to truly stop this sophisticated evasion, or is China's deep integration and legal adaptability simply too great to overcome?